And good morning. It is a delight and it is an honor to be at Southern Miss this morning, to be with you all. I am most grateful for the invitation, Sherry and Dr. Wiesenberg. Thank you very much. I would like to just sort of wander a little bit. I'm a Mississippi history teacher, and I tend to tell too much about the background of whatever the subject matter is, so I intend eventually to get to online learning, but it may take me a little while. A long time ago, well, this would have been back in the late 80s, I did my, by the way, I took my education courses at USM. I don't have a degree from here, but I have spent a lot of time on campus over the years. But I was working on my doctorate at Mississippi State, and the subject of it was, the title of it was Industrial Development and State Government Policy in Mississippi from 1890 to 1980. I do not recommend it unless you have difficulty sleeping one night. But I have had this passionate interest in Mississippi economic history, Mississippi history generally, but Mississippi economic history for a long, long time, particularly post-Civil War Mississippi history. Prior to the Civil War, there was a lot of wealth in this state. It was enormously malapportioned. In other words, there was a small group of very rich people and a whole lot of folks that were small farmers, and then a very large percentage of our population, of course, were African Americans who were enslaved. But there was a lot of wealth here. Most of that wealth was destroyed in the war. And so for a couple of generations after the Civil War ended in 1865, Mississippi was just absolutely flat of our backs economically. And what happened was that in South Mississippi we had the greatest forest, commercial forest, probably in the world. We had the virgin pine forest of South Mississippi. And so from the 1880s until the 1930s, that was a huge part of the economic engine in South Mississippi, was cutting those virgin pine forests down. Unfortunately, they didn't think in a very far-sighted manner in those days, and also the state tax system didn't encourage people to keep that land after the timber was cut, and so there was very little replanting done. And then aside from that, folks were just trying to make a living, scratching out whatever they could do in terms of row cropping on small farms. And of course, in North Mississippi, particularly in the Delta, you had large plantations that after the war were based on sharecropping. But in South Mississippi, folks just got by. My mother was from Mize, Mississippi, in Smith County. And her dad raised 6 kids, raising cotton, plowing a mule on red dirt that should never have seen a cotton plant. But that's what they had to do to get by, and that's what people in Mississippi had to do just to get by. And so for a long, long time, education was simply not that important. Now, circumstances began to change in the early years of this century, and not this century, early years of the last century, early years of the 20th century, and there began to be a more focused effort on behalf of the state of Mississippi as well as counties in our state to begin to educate people and emphasize the importance of that. One factor in that was the agricultural high schools. There were several dozen agricultural high schools that were created in our state. They were boarding schools, and there were many of them. One of them was at Mize, Mississippi, which is the town where I was born. And again, I'm making this perhaps more personal than I should, but I'll illustrate kind of how this affected people. I mentioned that my mother's family was from Smith County, from Mize. My father's folks were from northeast Mississippi. My father's father was born in a little bitty town called Montpelier in Clay County, and my father's mother was born in Vardaman, up in Calhoun County. Well, the story goes that my grandfather lost a corn crop rather, in a terribly wet winter wet year, winter leading into the spring and summer. This would have been about 1914 and 1915. And my grandmother had a brother who had moved to Smith County, and he sent word back that they had this wonderful new agricultural high school in Mize. And this was a great place to come, a lot of opportunities. So my father's folks moved from Clay County to Smith County in about 1915, when my dad was 2 years old. Now, my point being that the agricultural high schools were springing up. That's something new that we had in Mississippi. And they evolved into the community colleges in the 1920s. The legislature in the early 20s passed a law that authorized agricultural high schools to develop a 13th and 14th grade. Now, the first agricultural high school, which later became a community college, was Pearl River. And Pearl River opened its doors in 1909, and Sherry used to teach there, right? Used to work there. And so that's considered to be the founding of the community college system in Mississippi, is when Pearl River opened up in 1909. We had a couple of others that came shortly after that. Jones, I believe, and also Gulf Coast opened up in 1911. And they opened up as agricultural high schools, and in the 20s they evolved into community colleges, which is the beginning of our community college system. Mississippi is considered to have the first community college system in the United States. Not the first community colleges. I think those were actually in California. But we're considered to have the first community college system in the United States. Now, we have some slides here about the history of our community colleges, which Terry, are you able to do that? I don't know exactly what we need here. And I'm not going to refer to the slides individually, but I just kind of ask you to look at those to evoke the sense of history as we talk about what's going on moving forward. These, by the way, were provided by Dr. Charles Sullivan at Gulf Coast, which we appreciate very much. But again, in South Mississippi particularly, we're dealing with timber and small farming, and of course on the Gulf Coast itself with shipping. And at the beginning of the last century, particularly the port of Pascagoula was one of the busiest timber ports in the world. I remember, again, an odd statistic that sticks in my mind. In 1909, there was more pine timber shipped out of Pascagoula, Mississippi than any other place in the world at that time, which was a big part of the history of our state. So what we have then is, beginning in the 1920s, we have community colleges that grow out of the agricultural high schools. Community colleges have always been about access. That is one of the great benefits of community colleges in Mississippi, is we have always been about access. Our enrollment has boomed in recent years during the recession, and that is historically in line with what frequently happens. Because speaking from a community college perspective, our colleges are close to home, they're affordable, and traditionally we teach job skills, whatever that looks like at a given time. So the community colleges began to take root in the 20s. There was another kind of explosion of creation of community colleges in the 1940s. And we eventually evolved into the 15 colleges that we have now. Again, the colleges, having grown out of the agricultural high schools, had a base, had a physical presence, had facilities there which were simply enlarged and expanded. The mission was to provide access to all. That has always been the mission of Mississippi Community Colleges, is wherever a person is in his or her life, that person can come to a community college and make life better. And today, obviously we take people who have recently graduated high school, who are prepared to walk right into college, but then we also take people who don't have that preparation. If someone has dropped out of school, or if someone has been out of school for decades, we have the strongest adult basic education GED prep course program in the state, and we also take folks that may not be academically ready to do college work, and let those folks take developmental remedial classes to upgrade their skills. And a lot of people who do come to us, even as dropouts or maybe having been out of school for several decades, will stay in classes long enough, adult basic education, GED, or developmental classes, to prepare them to go on and do college work. Now, part of that, very much in line with that theme of open access and making education available to folks, whatever their situation, is in recent decades we have tried to move aggressively toward technology. Back in the 90s, we got involved in a program that was called the Community College Network, and this was a television-based program. But the idea was, again, to be able to make education accessible to people, even if they were not able to come to our campuses. From the Community College Network, we evolved into the Mississippi Virtual Community College System. Now, MSVCC, Mississippi Virtual Community College, is considered to be a model, and is considered to have been at the forefront of online education when it was started, when it was created in the late 90s and when it came into being about 10 years ago. We have always viewed it as an opportunity for access and convenience, and this is the main reason that folks come there. We have aggressively made online classes available to our citizens, and I will tell you that we are working very much in cooperation with our state university system to do that. You all probably are aware of the fact that Mississippi Virtual Community College set up a cooperative agreement, I guess 2 years ago now, with Southern Miss, which our impression is has been very successful and is growing quickly. We have expanded that to Jackson State. Jackson State was the second of our universities to enter into a cooperative agreement with MSVCC. And then in the past 6 months or so, the University of Mississippi Medical Center has done something similar to that. And in that particular case, the way it has worked is, and it's an extremely good example of the access that I'm talking about and seeking to provide access to people. Anyone who has gone 2 years to a community college and gotten an associate degree in some sort of medical technology field, whether it's in radiation therapy or dental hygiene or nurse assistant or whatever, can take that associate degree and enroll in University Medical Center in Jackson and take the second 2 years online, totally online, and get a bachelor's degree from University Medical Center while staying at home. In other words, a person who, say, graduates from Coahoma Community College and is living in Clarksdale, or a person who graduates from Itawamba Community College and living in Fulton, or someone from Pearl River who's living in Perkinston, can take the junior and senior year online, get a bachelor's degree, stay at home, perhaps be employed full-time while doing that, and then after 4 years have a bachelor's degree and have a great deal more economic power, economic opportunity than was true even last year because of the new arrangement. Of course, one of the advantages of MSVCC is that, one of the great advantages is we have cooperation among all the 15 colleges, and so a person can be enrolled at any one of our colleges and be taking a class that's offered 100 miles or 200 miles away at another one of our colleges. And the same model can work in terms of our cooperative agreements with our state universities. I would like to thank all the people who have been involved in developing MSVCC, and also in terms of the cooperation that we have required to do that, again, including our state universities. I'd like to share some statistics with you about the growth of MSVCC since it started in the fall of 2001. In that first fall semester, we had about 4,800 students who took about 8,300 classes. And then fall by fall, I'll just briefly read these to you. Fall of 2002, we had 7,100 students taking 13,000 classes. The next year, 9,000 students taking 16,000 classes. The next year, 11,000 students taking 22,000 classes. Then 13,000 students taking 28,000 classes. 15,000 students taking 32,000 classes. 17,000 students taking 36,000 classes. 21,000 students taking 45,000 classes. 25,000 students taking 56,000 classes. 28,000 students taking 61,000 classes. And this past fall, we had approximately 30,000 students taking approximately 65,000 classes. So over that 10-year period, the number of students grew 526%. The number of classes taken grew 684%. I again encourage our universities to expand into this area. Now, we were talking a moment ago. Obviously, some people are challenged by technology. I will tell you that I'm on the wrong side of some kind of a generational divide to make it easy or simple for me. I really have to work at it. But some people resist, some folks in higher education resist using technology, and there certainly have been some problems. When my son was an undergraduate back in the last decade, in the 2006-2007 area, he took a couple of online classes and they weren't very successful. I mean, the technology simply hadn't been integrated into the teaching process well enough to make it flow well, or to have the quality what it should be, what one would expect in a traditional class. And I kind of struggled with that for a while, primarily because of my son's experience. But I realized that basically two things. First off, the world's moving in that direction, and there's nothing any of us can do to stop it. And so, that being true, it seems to me that what we need to do is, number one, get on board, number two, do it right. Don't go kicking and screaming into technology, but go willingly and go with an attitude that we are going to make it just as good as a traditional class. And of course, the possibility is it'll be better because you have access to so many more resources than you do in a traditional class. So that's the attitude that we try to adopt in terms of MSVCC, and I think that we should try to adopt in terms of higher education generally. Now, you may have noticed that we all in higher education have funding challenges with our legislature these days, and not only these days, but for the past several years. If you go back to 2000, and community colleges are an example, but it's not unlike what's been going on with IHL. If you go back to 2000, about 55% of community colleges' yearly budget was appropriated by the state legislature. About 18% came from tuition and fees. Those numbers have come much, much closer together. And in the current fiscal year, our legislature's appropriation makes up about 39% of our budget, and tuition and fees make up about 35%. So one thing that's requiring us to do, requiring all of us to do, is to be as efficient as we possibly can in terms of how do we provide the product as efficiently as we can with the lowest cost that we can. Last week, we had our appropriations hearing before the Senate Appropriations Subcommittee at the Capitol, and I pointed out one of the advantages of MSVCC, and one of the reasons that it's a good thing that we've got 30,000 people taking 65,000 classes is we can deliver that class at about 70% of the cost of a traditional class in a bricks and mortar classroom. And so that is one of the advantages of it, aside from accessibility being so key. So what we have to do is we have to do more with less. We have to be smarter. We have to be more efficient. Now, I want to conclude by sharing some statistics with you. We in Mississippi tend to we tend to focus on the negative in terms of statistics when we're making comparisons to the national averages, whether it's income, whether it's education levels, whether it's infant mortality, whether it's obesity, whatever it is. We hear lots of negative statistics, and that's part of the world we live in, and we all need to do everything we can to turn those negative statistics around and make them positive. But I want to share some positive statistics with you. I began by saying that we in Mississippi were flat of our backs economically for 2 generations after the Civil War. In 1930, the first full year of the Great Depression, Mississippi's per capita income was 32.5% of the national average, slightly less than 1/3. But in every decade but one since then, we have made progress. We have made objective progress in terms of the prosperity of our citizens. And I want to share those numbers with you. Again, in 1930, our per capita income was 32.5% of the national average. In 1940, we were at 37%. Now, a huge part of what happened there was that Mississippi made a commitment that we were going to attract industry to our state. And in 1936, the legislature passed a law which became known as the Balanced Agriculture with Industry Act, or BAWI. It was proposed by Governor Hugh White, who was mayor of Columbia, who was a timberman who had seen the virgin pine forest cut out. And he convinced the folks in Columbia that they ought to put up money to construct buildings and equip them to get industries to move from Chicago or Patterson, New Jersey, or Gary, Indiana to Mississippi to hire our folks. And that was a successful model, and he convinced the legislature to do that statewide. And so from 1936 on, picking up speed in the 1940s and booming in the 1950s and 60s, we were very successful in Mississippi in attracting low-wage, low-capital, so-called footloose industries to our state. The classic example is the garment plant, the sewing plant. I bet most of you remember when there was a garment plant in every little town in Mississippi, almost, that you could go and look at. So, our folks were willing to work very hard, and the numbers reflect the success of their efforts. 1930, 32.5% of the national per capita income. 1940, 37%. 1950, 49%. A combination of industrial growth and World War II, money coming back from service people in the armed forces, and also contracts that our people had to provide war material. 1950, 49%. 1960, 53%. Huge jump in the 60s. 1970, we were at 66% of the national average per capita income. 1980, 69%. The only decade when we did not make progress was in the 80s. There was a very serious recession in the early part of that decade, and the 80s are when the garment plants started going off our shores. They first went to Mexico, now they're in China. And so low-wage, low-capital industry began to bypass Mississippi and the American South to go where they could pay even lower wages. And so in 1980, we were at 69% of the national average per capita income. In 1990, we were at 67%. But we began to move back upward in the last decade of the 20th century. In 2000, we were at 70% of the national per capita income. And we've had another big growth spurt in the past decade. In 2010 census, we were at 77% of the national per capita income. So, 2 thoughts I'd leave you with. First, Mississippi has made enormous progress, objective progress in terms of the quality of life of our citizens, the quality of life that was available to them in the past 80 years. I mean, if you go from less than 1/3 to more than 3/4 of the national per capita income, nobody can object, nobody can argue that that's not enormous progress. The other thought is this. Most of that was done irrespective of folks' educational levels. You did not have to be educated to work at a sewing plant in Mize, Mississippi, or Perkinston, Mississippi, or any other town in Mississippi. What you had to do is you had to put in long hours, work really hard. Again, going back to when I was working on my dissertation 20 plus years ago, I remember a quote that said, "Nobody ever got rich working in a garment plant, but it beat the heck out of sharecropping." And that's absolutely right. It beat the heck out of sharecropping, but that option is not available to us now. So my concluding point is, really for the very first time in Mississippi history, we have absolutely no choice but to educate our people. I mean, the 21st century is going to, already does, belong to educated people. Folks who are, for goodness sakes, high school dropouts, but even folks to a large extent who have a high school education and not beyond that are marginalized. They're marginalized economically, they're marginalized socially, and the world has changed, and there's just not much available to folks who aren't educated beyond high school. Certainly not for folks who drop out of high school. And so it is more important, and again, this is not an idle statement, it is absolutely more important than it has ever been before that we encourage our folks to stay in school, certainly that we do everything we can to make our state officials understand the importance of that and adequately fund higher education in Mississippi. But whatever we have to work with, it is incredibly important in terms of the future of our citizens that we seek them out, that we encourage them to get an education, to stay in education, even if there are serious obstacles, even if there are serious challenges, because that's where the future lies. There are actually a lot of jobs going begging for folks to fill them in Mississippi today, but they're not for unskilled people. They're for skilled people. They're for people who have either job training or academic education that allows them to seek a better life for themselves and their families. And I might add, pay more taxes to the local and state governments. My thought is very much one of encouragement. My thought is to ask you all, both in terms of the online component, for accessibility, for seeking out people who might otherwise not go to college, but in terms of education generally, to encourage you to continue to do what you're doing and do it smarter and do it more efficiently, because that's where our future lies. Thank you. Thank you very much.